So, Steve, thank you very much for joining us. Let me introduce Steve. Steve is Director of Science and the Deputy Chief Executive of the Plymouth Marine Laboratory in the UK. And I thought about this session really as an introduction to all of the things that we're going to be, or scene setting for all of the things that we're going to be discussing across the next 2 days, really was to try and get our heads around the science of what is happening to the ocean at the moment. And ask three questions, really. What is the state of the ocean as we understand it now? What do we now understand about the ocean as a system, which I think is extremely important because this is a relatively new phenomenon? And what should our response to what looks like an escalating crisis in the ocean, what should our response be to that? So, Steve, let's start, first of all, with what is the extent and scale of the problems that we face in the ocean, in your view, as a scientist?
Oh, my word, that's some opening question, isn't it? Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and have this conversation. Slightly more daunting environment than our usual catch-ups and our chats around this, but hopefully they'll be as enjoyable as I find the ones when we talk about these issues. So, yes, certainly we face enormous challenges as we look at the way in which our ocean is changing around us. We can pinpoint many of the drivers back to our own behaviours and our own actions. And as we spoke about, the fear that these impacts are accelerating in front of our very eyes, but not just accelerating in terms of the rate in which they are happening, but the severity of the consequences, but also the compound effects of multiple things happening in the same place at the same time. So a variety of actions coming together to create greater impacts than we'd have expected on their own.
So what is the evidence that things may or are, in your view, accelerating at this point in time, the impacts of climate change and biodiversity? What is the evidence that it has accelerated?
The evidence has been largely documented in many of the global reports we've seen, IPCC reports, IPBES reports. We see the IOC UNESCO State of the Ocean report, all of which documents the increasing stress placed onto the ocean and the ecosystems that exist within the ocean. But I think I'd also like to say that the evidence that we have is merely the tip of the iceberg. We invest very little in observing our oceans. And that is concerning in the fact that what we see effectively is just part of the story. And the more we peer into the processes, the interactions, the ecosystem responses, the more worrying the picture becomes.
So obviously we don't have the full picture in front of us. So how much certainty do you think we should place on these signs of growing distress in the ocean? And we've heard, for example, that the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation, may be slowing. We've heard of increasing polar ice melts. How much certainty can we place around the acceleration component of that?
I think we can put pretty great certainty around it. I think we need to be confident that the changes we're seeing are real, they're concerning, they're worrying. It's time to act. I mean, you can think about it that, failure, having knowledge to the extent that we now have and the failure to act would be irresponsible.
Let's come on to that in a second. I know we're slightly compressed with time, but let's just talk a little bit about the ocean as a system. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, this is relatively recent thinking. At least outside of the science community. Why is it important that we understand the ocean as a complex, interconnected system? And how do we interpret some of the new thinking around the boundaries that we think some of the impacts in the ocean are potentially reaching?
Okay, well, firstly, there we go. Is that better? Yeah. I think I've just knocked it slightly. Okay, hopefully I'm back. Let's not think about the ocean as a system. I mean, the ocean is just part of the planetary system. The connectivity between the huge cycles of water, of carbon, of nutrients they don't recognize the ocean boundaries. And if we try to manage the ocean as some kind of independent entity, then we're doomed to failure. We know that our behaviors largely exist in the terrestrial realm, but the consequences are far-reaching. So let's think about the ocean as part of the planetary system, first and foremost. But then also we understand how the interactions between those large global cycles are so intertwined. Changes in weather can have huge impacts on freshwater input into coastal areas, changing coastal chemistry. So things that we might think are purely a chemical or a biological response actually are far more integrated, far more interconnected. So we really need to think holistically about managing not just the ocean system, but the whole system and our behaviors within that. And I think we'll probably get onto the concept of what our role is within the system.
Can I just ask you to say something about the planetary boundaries concept? Because I think that is a concept that is both useful, extremely useful, but also has some drawbacks. What would you say is the right way to think about that, or the scientist's way of thinking about that?
Yeah, something we have talked about a lot. I see the value in setting boundaries, planetary boundaries, concept of, thinking about how we live within our means, how we're conscious of what our impacts are, and talk a lot about sustainability and sustainable, and you see it written on the board there. But I wonder whether the concept of these boundaries and the concept of sustainability itself, in fact, makes us think in the wrong way. It makes us think that there are ways in which we can operate which have no consequence, which we operate free of the thought that we create damage. But we don't. We are part of the Earth system, the ocean system. We are an intrinsic part of the ocean ecosystem, whether we recognize it or not. Every action we take has a consequence, and that's okay. We have every right to be here on this planet and exist within the ecosystem. But those rights should not supersede those of the other humans with which we share the system with, and the other living entities who depend on that system as well. So I think we need to start to change that mindset about thinking that we can operate within the system, within safe limits and safe boundaries, and therefore, and justifying a certain level of damage, and say that's okay. I feel that sometimes the striving for sustainability and to stay within boundaries makes us focus on doing the least amount of damage rather than focusing it around and actually striving towards reducing our footprint in the system to becoming so that we have the lightest footprint we possibly can.
So I think that's, and we have to sort of end here, but I think that's a really nice way. And if I could just ask you to extend that thought to what that means for what we're discussing across the next 2 days, and that is, how do we move towards a more sustainable use of the ocean and a more sustainable interaction and relationship that we have with the ocean?
Well, first of all, I think we absolutely sit at a crux. Now is the time to rethink how we approach our relationship with the ocean. We talk about the ocean as if it's an entity that we interact with. We should start talking about ocean rather than the ocean. An ocean that we are part of, and it is part of us. And then we need to think about how we become more honest with ourselves in terms of our actions, and strive for a relationship between society and nature that is more respectful, is more equitable, and more ethical, not just amongst ourselves, but also within the entire ocean itself.
Steve Whittingham, thank you so much for helping us set the scene. I think that tone is exactly the tone that I hope that we can take with us through the course of these next 2 days and think about when we talk about all the issues we're going to be talking about. Steve Whittaker, thanks so much. To join me, thank you, Steve.